With the release of Cowboys from Hell and its subsequent albums, each being sold to millions of satisfied fans, it seemed everything was going right for Pantera, but this would soon change. Throughout a couple of years, the band became increasingly polarized, until eventually, Pantera broke up. But why did Pantera break up? In this video, I will cover the series of events that explain the rise of Pantera, why they broke up, and where Pantera as a band is now. In 1981, Vinny was asked to join a band formed by his classmates. It had Terry Glaze on lead guitar, Tommy Bradford on bass, and Donnie Hart on vocals. However, he would only join the band if he could bring Daryl into it as well. Despite Terry having harsh remarks about Daryl, the band agreed to let him join. The band was first called Gemini, being inspired by other bands like Journey and Heart. This would soon change into Eternity, and then finally, the name Pantera was decided from the name of a race car called the De Tomaso Pantera. Pantera also means panther in Spanish, which is pretty cool. The band liked this name and decided to stick with it. 1 year later, Donnie and Tommy would leave the band, requiring Terry to be on guitar and vocals, and hiring Rex Rocker, later known as Rex Brown, on bass. While this was happening, Dale began to improve at the guitar rapidly and would become the permanent lead guitarist. Since it was the 80s and glam metal was all the rage, that's what this version of Pantera wanted to look and sound like. This meant that they would wear makeup and hairspray on stage. This is quite a far cry from what they would look like only a decade later. In 1983, Pantera released the first album called Metal Magic. They used the musical expertise of the Abbott brothers' dad to produce all of the 80s albums. This album had a sound very similar to Pantera's influences, but unfortunately, this album received harsh feedback from critics. This resulted in the album being commercially unsuccessful, selling only 5,000 copies by 1990. Despite this, they would release another album the following year called Projects in the Jungle. On this album, Pantera began to sound less like their influences and develop their own unique sound. While critics were still harsh on Terry's vocals, they acknowledged the improvements from the previous album. The band even created the first music video for the song All Over Tonight. Due to improvements in quality and the making of a music video, this album sold double the number of records as the previous album. The following year, Pantera would release another album called Eye on the Night. This album introduced a heavier metal style, quite a change from glam metal. Pantera would also make their second music video for a song Hot and Heavy. Just like the last album, the number of sales doubled. However, with the band's sound getting heavier, Terry Glaze decided to leave as he wanted to continue pursuing glam metal instead. This meant that Diamond Daryl, Vinnie Paul, and Rex Rocker would have to find a new vocalist, but who could replace Terry? The first candidate to replace Glaze was Matt Lamore. However, he couldn't hit the high notes that Terry could, and he lacked stage presence, so he wasn't a viable option. The second candidate to replace Glaze was Rick Mathiasen, an El Paso Native American. However, his culture contrasted with the band's southern culture, making him leave quicker than Matt. Luckily, he was able to land as a singer for other bands like Steel Prophet and Agent Steel. The third candidate to replace Glaze was the old schoolmate of the Abbott brothers, Dave Peacock. Out of the previous two candidates, Dave stayed the longest and would help Pantera on his fourth album. Unfortunately, after working on the album, the rest of the band found Dave's voice to be unsuitable for their heavier sound. At this point, Pantera was getting desperate for a singer and would actually go back to Donnie Hart for the fourth candidate. However, Hart knew that he wasn't the right fit for Pantera's evolving sound, so he declined. This process of unsuccessful auditions would end with their fifth candidate, Phil Anselmo. As soon as the band heard his singing abilities, he was hired on the spot and would stay with Pantera for as long as it would last. While this was happening, the big four of metal were beginning to release heavier music. From 1986 to 87, albums like Master of Puppets, Rain and Blood, Among the Living, and Peace Sells with Who's Buying were being released. These albums would influence Pantera's heavier sound, which can be found on their next album called Power Metal. Despite its name, it has nothing to do with the actual power metal subgenre, and it doesn't sound anything like it. Out of Pantera's previous albums, this one was by far the heaviest. It would feature a mix of glam metal and thrash metal, and on some songs, they would even merge the two. This album can be thought as a bridge between their early 80s glam era to their 90s metal era. They would also change their attire to something more casual. Right after the album was released, released, Dave Mustaine of Megadeth reached out to Diamond Daryl to play for them. Just like how Vinny wanted to bring Daryl into Pantera, Daryl wanted to bring Vinny into Megadeth. However, Megadeth already had a drummer, meaning there was no use for Vinny to join. Because of this, Daryl declined the offer and would be soon replaced by Marty Friedman. But can you imagine if Daryl and Vinny were in Megadeth? I think that sounds pretty interesting, maybe in an alternate timeline. As you've seen in the previous sections, the glam era of Pantera wasn't exactly successful. This would change on their next album as they focused on being commercially successful. This resulted in Pantera hiring a manager, a new producer, and they changed record labels to Echo Records. In 1990, Pantera released Cowboys from Hell. This album established the groove metal sound that they're known for, and it was actually considered Pantera's first album by Spotify. While Spotify is technically wrong here, the 80s Pantera sounds like a completely different band than the 90s Pantera. Even though this album had a slow start in terms of sales, it achieved the 27th spot in the Billboard 200 in 1992 and would get a platinum certification in 1997. Unlike their 80s albums, which received harsh feedback from critics, this album is considered by critics to be one of their best. For example, IGN declared this album to be the 19th most successful heavy metal albums of all time. To gain extra popularity, Pantera became the opening act for other famous bands like Exodus, Suicidal Tendencies, Judas Priest, Sepultura, and many more. Opening for all these famous bands gave them enough recognition to perform at the Monsters of Rock concert in Moscow. This concert had a large attendance of over 500,000 people and also featured internationally known bands like Metallica and AC/DC. Pantera performing alongside these other bands exposed their music to a newer, broader audience, positively impacting their success. In 1992, Pantera released Vulgar Display of Power, with it advancing the band's groove metal sound. This album received great reviews from critics and is their best-selling album to date. A notable song from this album is Walk, as it is their most streamed song on Spotify. It was also around this time that Daryl changed his stage name from Diamond Daryl to Dimebag Daryl, and Rex Rocker changed his name to Rex Brown. Also, 20 years later, Pantera released a single called Piss, which was an unreleased song intended to be on this album. Moving back to 1994, Pantera released Far Beyond Driven. The single called I'm Broken debuted as number 1 on the US and Australian charts and would receive the band's first Grammy nomination for Best Metal Performance. However, in June of 1994, Phil Anselmo was charged with assault for attacking a security guard who blocked fans from getting on stage. Luckily, he would get released with a bail of $5,000 the next day. He would still have to go to court, where he pleaded guilty to attempted assault and was sentenced to 100 hours of community service. After Anselmo completed that, the band would go back to the studio to produce another album. However, at this time, Anselmo began to report chronic back pain. He hypothesized that the years of touring and intense performances were the cause for this. When you look at the live videos from this time, this is a pretty fair assessment. For the time being, he would drink alcohol to alleviate the pain, but soon this would affect his reputation and health. Anselmo couldn't take the back pain anymore and went to see a doctor. They suggested that surgery could fix his back problems. However, doing the surgery would require Anselmo to be in recovery for a long time. Although the pain was bothering Anselmo, he didn't want to be out of the band for a long time, so he did something that he would later regret. He begins to use heroin as a painkiller without informing the band. This would be one of the many mistakes Anselmo would make. Not long after, at a Montreal concert, Anselmo stated that, quote, "Rap music advocates the killing of white people." This is quite a controversial thing to announce, and fans began to speculate that Anselmo was racist. Anselmo responded to the allegations by saying that he was just drunk and that the remark was a mistake. In 1996, Pantera released The Great Southern Trendkill. This album was recorded quite weirdly. Anselmo recorded his vocal parts in New Orleans, while the rest of the band recorded their parts in Dallas. This could explain why this album has more overdubbed vocals, and could signify the beginning of their breakup. Overall, the album reached number 4 on the Billboard 200. However, something unfortunate would happen 2 months after the album's release. While touring with I Hate God and White Zombie, Phil Anselmo overdosed on heroin.
I overdosed and killed myself for about 4 minutes. I think it shook everybody else up. I was in bliss, actually. I was gone. Don't remember anything. And when you come out of something like that and you wake up, A, embarrassed, B, you see how it affects everybody around you. Just those two elements right there, no, there's no way that could ever happen again. So through more positive thought and through true inner strength, I truly learn from my mistakes, and I have that ability to turn that light switch off. And I'm going to keep that particular light switch off in my life forever.
Luckily, he was able to live on, and he apologized to his bandmates for his use of heroin. However, the damage had already been done. Because Phil hadn't disclosed his drug usage to the band, it was a shock to them, and they were very embarrassed about Phil's drug addiction. You would think that Phil would keep his word and quit heroin, but according to Dimebag's girlfriend, he relapsed 2 times after the incident. Around 3 years later, Phil and the rest of the band would venture out into their own side projects. Phil Anselmo worked with bands like Necrophagia, Ebon, and Viking Crown, while the rest of the band was making a country metal crossover project called Rebel Meets Rebel. In 2000, the band would be back in the studio to produce their last studio album called Reinventing the Steel. It managed to reach number 4 on the Billboard 200 and was certified gold by the RIA. Funnily, after this, Pantera was a guest musician on SpongeBob, of all things. The song Death Rattle from the latest album was used in an episode titled Pre-Hibernation Week. In 2001, Anselmo was back doing side projects with other bands. He worked with bands like the Down Supergroup, which Rex Brown would later join, and his own band called Superjoint Ritual. Anselmo promised the band that he would only indulge in side projects for a year. However, his touring schedule with his side projects would prolong his time off Pantera. This time off created distancing from the rest of the band, which the Abbott brothers hated. They hoped that Anselmo would eventually come back to the group after his work with side projects, and that his distancing was only mutual. However, Anselmo did not return. This made the Abbott brothers conclude that Anselmo abandoned the band as he hadn't communicated in them in over 2 years. This resulted in Pantera officially breaking up in November 2003. When Anselmo discovered this, he fought back verbally, which would get reported in the press. These arguments further polarized the band, leading the Abbott brothers to start a new band called Damage Plan. Damage Plan had Dimebag on lead guitar, Vinny on drums, Pat Lackman on vocals, and Bob Zillow on bass. In 2004, Damage Plan would make their first album called Newfound Power. Despite the early success, some fans thought this album wasn't as high quality as Pantera. Unfortunately, this album would soon be their last due to what tragically happens next. On December 8th, 2004, while playing Damage Plan songs live in Columbus, Ohio, at the Alrosa Villa, a 25-year-old schizophrenic man named Nathan Gale shot Dimebag Darrell. With the pull of a trigger, a metal legend died prematurely, exactly 24 years after John Lennon's death. Dimebag wasn't the only victim. Nathan would also shoot a fan, a club employee, a security official, a drum technician, and a band's tour manager. Before any more damage could be done, a policeman would shoot Nathan. You may now be thinking, what would motivate Nathan to do such horrendous actions? As I mentioned earlier, Nathan was diagnosed with having schizophrenia. In this case, he thought that Pantera had stolen the lyrics to songs that he had made. In his mind, the only way to prevent more songs from being stolen was to kill the man himself. When news of this incident quickly spread, the sales of Pantera and Damage Plan records skyrocketed. At Dimebag's funeral, he was buried in a Kiss casket, the band Kiss that is, and with Eddie Van Halen's Bumblebee guitar. Gene Simmons of Kiss rarely made these caskets, however he made one just for a special occasion. Before he died, Dimebag asked Eddie for his Bumblebee guitar and was originally going to receive a copy of it. However, Van Halen gave him the real one after finding out what happened to him. Vinny, having just lost his younger brother, got angry at Anselmo, saying that, quote, his day was coming. Anselmo responded that if his day was coming, it would just cause Vinny to feel the grief of losing another brother. But now that legend has died, what will happen to the bandmates? Will they possibly reunite? After the incident, Vinny would work on which is a collaboration band between him and the members of Mudvayne and Nothing Face. While that was happening, Anselmo and Rex Brown were back doing side projects with a Down supergroup, as well as supporting Heaven and Hell, Megadeth, and Metallica on their tours. In a 2012 interview, Vinny was asked if a reunion of Pantera would ever happen, and he said that it would only happen if his brother was still here. In other words, it's not happening. And if by some miracle it did happen, he wouldn't be in it, as on July 22nd, 2018, Vinny Paul died of dilated cardiomyopathy and coronary artery disease, and would be buried next to his brother and mother. This means, as of now, both the Abbott brothers, who were the heart and soul of Pantera from the start, have unfortunately perished. Luckily, that miracle I mentioned earlier did happen. Pantera reunited. This happened to make way for a 2023 tour, which is exactly 20 years after they disbanded. To fill in the missing bandmates, Zakk Wylde, a former guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne and Black Label Society, and Charlie Bennett, the drummer of Anthrax, were selected. On top of that, there's also a possibility that this reunited Pantera is going to produce music again, well, with an asterisk. You see, even though Zakk Wylde and Charlie Bennett are amazing musicians, it won't be the same Pantera without Dimebag and Vinnie's influence. This does mean that this reunited Pantera can make new music, but under a new pseudonym. As of now, Pantera is on an international tour and is also supporting Metallica's M72 tour. So, there you have it. Why Pantera broke up and where they are now. From a high school band with constantly evolving sounds to selling millions of records to being disbanded to now where Pantera is back in almost full glory. If you like this video, consider subscribing and checking out this video as well.